But hopefully this was still a good opportunity to do a little bit of that, build some relationships, strengthen some relationships. So I'm going to transition us into our deep dive for today. And I was thinking back about it and why we got so interested to have this conversation with Ashton, Ruby, and Kendall about their experience doing value chain coordination work within city and state government offices. And it was making me remember probably like 8 years ago, seeing a job posting for a city food systems coordinator. I think it was for the city of Denver. And I thought to myself, like, wow, that's really awesome. A food systems coordinator within a city government. I never heard of that before. The time that was the first time that I personally had come across a position of that kind. And today I'm seeing job postings for value chain coordinators situated within city or county or state governments a lot. They may not use the term value chain coordination, but usually that's the role or set of roles that they're describing. And particularly since COVID, we've seen a mushrooming in efforts of local and of state government agencies that are working to bridge the gaps between regional farms and the local community and the local economy. So today we get to have a conversation with 3 awesome people who have those very cool jobs doing value chain coordination work within city and within state government. And we hope that by hearing some of their perspectives and hearing about their experience, it can shed light on the unique roles of value chain coordination within local and state government, and also give lessons for all of us about how we can think strategically about how we might form allies and partnerships with our own local and state governments. So without much more preamble, I'm going to introduce Kendall Chavez. Kendall, you want to give a wave? Who is the Food and Hunger Coordinator for the New Mexico Governor's Office. We're also joined today by Ruby Ferguson, the Food Equity Policy Lead for the Greater Chicago Food Depository, and Ashton Wright, who just became the Executive Director of Food Connection at the University of Kentucky, but before that worked for a while as the local food and ag development director within the office of the mayor of Lexington, Kentucky. Such a mouthful. So though Ashton just changed jobs, she has been generous enough to share some of her wisdom and insight about her in-depth experience working within the office of the mayor. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves and tell us about their work. We have about 40 minutes until the top of the hour and several questions to get through. But these questions are just to spark conversation. So panelists, encourage you to have a conversation with one another, and to everyone listening in, you all have a lot of wisdom and experience and ideas to share. So we will have 10 minutes for a Q&A at the end, but encourage you to add questions and thoughts into the chat box or raise your hand, and we will try and take them as they come. So now let's see. Andrew, are you able to spotlight our presenters? Might make it a little easier to see.
And change it to speaker view. Does that change the view for everyone?
No, I think that's just us. Let's see. I think I might be able to do it. Got 1. Got 2. Awesome, cool. So hey y'all, Ashton, Ruby, and Kendall. Wanted to just ask y'all to start us off today by just telling us some about your role and particularly how it interacts with and impacts the local food economy where you work. So Ashton, can I ask you to start?
Sure. Hey everybody, good to be with you all. So my role at the city was established 8 years ago in June. So one of those early, I feel like Lexington, Kentucky, we often don't get heralded for being first in many things, but I think we're unique in that we were early adopters of this work. My role at the city really was modeled after work that was done just down the road in Louisville. The Louisville Farm to Table program was one of the inaugural value chain coordination roles in our state. And our current vice mayor and the mayor at the time was really interested in better connecting Lexington, which is the second largest city in Kentucky, and is surrounded in every direction by really vibrant farmland. In Lexington, we're known for horses, but there's quite a bit of food production happening in and around central Kentucky. And so they were really interested in how to get more of that locally produced food into the urban environment. And so my position was housed in the office of the mayor within the economic development group. I was an N of one, only one person operating in this space, but really we saw the work through an economic development lens, trying to better connect and create new and sustainable market opportunities for farmers and local food producers, with a heavy emphasis on larger institutional and wholesale market opportunities. Still worked with a lot of direct marketing farmers, with farmers markets and CSAs, but really we're trying to help folks who are interested in dipping their toe or growing their wholesale business. So that's a little bit about how the position got started. And really, I saw my role, in addition to a matchmaker, as a convener. So I had an advisory committee and developed really meaningful community partnerships to try to better coordinate and be more strategic about all of the programs and resources that were being targeted towards local food systems development. So I'll stop there and let Ruby or Kendall go.
Go ahead, Kendall.
Sorry, y'all. I'm on the phone. I'm at a conference, and so we have the 2-second delay thing happening here. Thanks, Ruby. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kendall Chavez. As mentioned, I oversee the food and hunger work in the Office of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham here in New Mexico. Currently calling in from a conference with like 200 school nutrition professionals that I haven't seen in 2.5 years. So if you see me like doing this, that's what's happening. My role in the governor's office, so this role was created back in June. Our governor has long had a priority around addressing childhood hunger, and also has identified sustainable ag, specifically in value-added agriculture, as one of the main top 9 economic sort of sectors that our administration would focus on. And so I came in June to really figure out how to weave those two sort of values and really priorities from the governor into a comprehensive legislative and budget and administrative agenda for all of state government. So that was my task. Come in, help weave, and as you all know from your work likely across the country, food systems partners are very complex, very diverse, and I had the hard task of sort of finding a middle ground or a roadmap for people who are all over the landscape in terms of equity, conservation, things like that. And so the lens for my work is really different from Ashton's, as she mentioned. Mine is more on food security and addressing food like hunger. New Mexico has one of the highest rates of hunger and food insecurity in the country for a number of reasons, mostly perennial issues of poverty and just the remoteness of our state. And so everything that I do that is all VCC oriented or that all local ag or producer oriented is all with the focus again of developing market opportunities to keep New Mexico produce and New Mexico foods in New Mexico for those that need it most. And so that's the sort of frame and the structure that I'm working in here in the state, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruby Ferguson, and I am the Food Equity Policy Lead with the Greater Chicago Food Depository, detailed to the Mayor's office here in Chicago. And so I am in a role similar to Kendall, where we're kind of zooming out and thinking about food equity as a whole. And I think that means that we need to think about all aspects of our food system. For some context, Chicago's Food Equity Council is relatively new. We just had an executive order signed in February of this year to help codify the Food Equity Council. But this council was really founded in a response to what we saw during 2020, and really was in response to kind of racist systems that had existed in our food system, and how can we start to be accountable and transparent in the work that we're doing to improve food access across the city. So we have 5 priorities that span across our food system. So everything from emergency food to urban agriculture to even supporting BIPOC food businesses. And then we have a total of 4 working groups that dive deep into those spaces. And so one of those working groups is our institutional procurement work group that really uplifts the work that's been happening with GFPP across the city, but gives a kind of laser focus and buy-in from the mayor's support.
All right, thanks you all for sharing that about your roles and how they were created as well. That was our next question, but you've answered it. So appreciate that. And wanted to hear now, since it is still kind of a unique role to be within government doing value chain coordination work, what are some of the benefits to that, like things you can do that others cannot? And then what are some of the limitations of doing value chain coordination from within government? And let's start with Kendall this time.
I would say I, for better or for worse, carry the weight of the governor. And we have our governor is very passionate and just as and as all likely are all governors, but if she has a vision, it's expected to get done, right? So this is one of her priorities, and that was the task when I came on board, is just to execute the vision and get it done. I think the important piece about having the executive fully on board with food systems work, food security work, and local agriculture work is that we can sort of encourage and incentivize in ways that other entities can't. So for example, I know a lot of states are struggling with the local food assistance grant that USDA, or the cooperative agreement that USDA just put out. I just had to make one phone call and say, get it done, and we got it done. And so that's the sort of power of, again, the executive really leading, offering our services and our support as needed, but really setting the expectation that all of state government, because I work in the governor's office for us, all of state government is expected to work towards a food security response or a set of solutions for the state. And so I would say that's the greatest strength there, is having, again, the muscle and the leverage from the governor's office or the executive.
Yeah, and I can chime in there. I think the Food Equity Council is in its early stages, and so we're still exploring what execution looks like. But the fact that there is now a person thinking about food in the mayor's office and is able to connect dots across work groups and kind of zoom out and see the larger vision is really important. I think all of us know very intimately that food intersects with so many parts of our lives. It's transportation, it's zoning, it's cultural affairs, it's all of these things, right? And so having someone who can have that food equity perspective is really powerful, and the power to convene. So understanding that you can bring some stakeholders to the table in a way that you might not have been able to before because it's coming from the mayor's office or the governor's office.
Yeah, I would definitely, I made some notes beforehand, and you all touched on both of those. I think having the muscle, as Kendall alluded to, of the chief executive, whether it's a city or a state, can really open up a lot of doors and bring a lot of people to the table that maybe not otherwise wouldn't have an interest or reason to do so is important. And again, as Ruby mentioned, being that coordinating entity across stakeholders, getting folks to streamline resources and programming. So we're making sure we're not duplicating efforts was a really big priority for us. Andrew, I don't know if you asked us, but I might segue into some of the limitations of government. While it does have its strengths, government as a whole, in my experience, is not incredibly nimble. It can be, depending on the issue, but sometimes it takes a long time to get things done. And obviously the politics associated with some of these choices. In Lexington, the mayoral race is a nonpartisan election. However, inevitably politics infiltrates every conversation we have, whether it's within the mayor's office or with city council. And then one really unique, I think, limitation, and I don't know if other panelists have this similar issue, maybe Ruby more so than Kendall, given you're at a municipality. My funding for my position initially early on was kind of a hodgepodge of funding. It was partially, city only had a little bit of skin in the game initially, and it was funded heavily by our state agricultural development board, which is essentially our tobacco settlement dollars geared toward, which are to be used for helping farmers transition away from tobacco into additional enterprises. And so given that it was funded largely by this statewide organization, I had a little bit more latitude in terms of the geographic area that I worked with. After several years, it was a huge win in some respects that the city took on took the full burden of paying for my salary. However, it did constrain the work a bit in terms of, having to our food system does not stop, as you all know, does not stop at a county line. And so I was constantly having to make the case to council in particular, why I was working with farmers 2 counties over, because our food system is inherently connected. So.
Yeah, and I can chime in, Ashton. I think, and this also connects to the question that French brought up in the chat of kind of how is your position or programs institutionalized? And so I mentioned that the Food Equity Council is relatively new. Chicago's Food Equity Agenda was published in June 2021, and I started in August, and an executive order was signed in February. What you'll notice is that I am an employee of the Food Depository, which means that the Food Depository kind of stepped up to pay for this role so that we didn't have to wait for budget season to come around and to persuade city council that this position is valuable, but that we could hit the ground running on this work. So I think that's one of the pieces to kind of flag and think about in terms of, I guess, limitations. And I think something that also comes with my role is the Food Depository is an incredible organization that does a lot of work in the emergency food space. But I think a large limitation that happens is that people have a narrow perspective of what increasing food access looks like. And so a lot of times people automatically go to, oh, is that food deserts? Are you putting more food pantries places? Which is a sign that our food system has failed us, right? And food pantries are incredibly valuable. And so I don't want to take away from that, but we should be thinking about how we can leverage dollars that are being spent on our food system to support communities in a way that can be transformative. So I think sometimes there is that limitation of trying to explain what is food equity in a soundbite and how it intersects with all of these things, especially for folks who may not be familiar with all the work that goes into increasing food access and food sovereignty.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I think for me,
go ahead, Kendall, please.
Ashton, go. Okay, sorry. I think the only thing I'll add to, just to echo what's already been stated, for obvious reasons, my role too is overlaid on top of we have 4-year terms for our governors. My boss, our governor, is running for re-election right now, and so that adds a whole other layer, which I'm sure Ruby and Ashton can speak to as well, of the sort of politicalness of the situation. And so, again, when I was asked to come in, this sort of 4-pillared framework that we worked on, one was around community food programs that we are working on. The second is around institutional purchasing and supporting farmers to scale up for those markets. Third was around supply chain, value chain more broadly, so looking at aggregation, distribution, and fourth, looking at financial sustainability and equitable disbursement and deployment of resources. So when I came on board, I had that vision that was very community driven, and we worked with hundreds of people all over the state for a matter of 6 to 8 months. But the way that we message that and the way that we implement that work and the way that it's operationalized changes within the context of somebody who's running for re-election. And so I think that's all part of this. It is an absolute limitation of this work. For me, my position is I'm privately funded right now. The governor has advisors for economic development and public safety and others, and food security, food access, food systems work is a priority for her. So we were sort of piloting what this would look like. And so I am privately funded in this moment, per the comment Ruby made as well, to kind of show that this position matters, that we can show impact, within a matter of a year or two. And then we will use, we'll go back to the legislature for funding for this position in the long term. But just want to add on a few other layers to what's already been shared. Ashton, pass it back to you.
No, that was great. I just wanted to elaborate more on, the instability that you all have touched on in terms of funding. While it was, again, as I mentioned, a huge win that that the city committed to funding the position, as opposed to getting it from Ag Development Board, it still is an appointed position. And so I am an at-will employee. And so I was fortunate to survive an administration change. But it does, obviously, you know, it's uncertain from administration to administration. And the current mayor is actually running for a second term. But given that I just left, there is uncertainty about whether that position will be filled, even though there's funding dedicated for it. I certainly hope it will be, but that's just the nature of being situated in government and it being associated with politics.
And it's okay, I want to add one more thing, Andrew, before you go on. I just want to say the strength in numbers approach is really something that this broader food security agenda, we've worked very closely with the legislature. We have the benefit here of having a one party controlling well, it depends on how you look at it. One party controlling the executive and the legislative bodies. And so we've worked very closely with our legislature to make sure that this agenda is shared. So even so that it has staying power beyond the governor. And I think that's a huge, or the executive or whoever the chief executive is. But I think that piece and that strategy is huge. So that it's not a one trick pony or one individual's solo prioritization of an issue that affects everybody across the state. So.
And sorry, Andrew, but Kendall, you brought up something really important from the Food Equity Council in the Chicago perspective. Having multiple stakeholders at the table, that looks like making sure that community is involved as well. So each of our work groups is co-led by a city department or sister agency and a community-based organization. So that way there's ownership across the board, and even the design of priorities and objectives, community was involved with that as well. So there gives a level of accountability to your constituents to think about these are priorities that leaders in this space elevated and want to advance.
Awesome. No, great to see y'all spurring each other's thinking and building on it. So don't apologize for that. The next question, kind of building on that, you've all spoken a little bit about impact or what the goals were, within these appointed positions. And we've been thinking a lot at the Wallace Center about how you measure success in value chain coordination. And so wanted to give you all a chance to share that about, it's a lot of, you can look at numbers and how much food is moved because that's like part of the core of it, but most times it's in service of something else, of another value, another larger level impact. So if you could speak to some of that for your roles, and let's start with Ruby.
Yeah, so I will start, and I know I keep saying that the Food Equity Council is in its early stages, but that means that we haven't put out an annual report. We're kind of activating objectives for the first time. But I think something that has come up repeatedly from community, and I think is important to me for context, I'm a dietitian by training, is that we start to look at metrics beyond pounds of food moved or servings of fruits and vegetables per day, but start to tell the story of all the things that food means. And the reason why that is so important to me, and I think important to community members as well, is because when you have this narrow focus of just kind of getting food to people, you don't really think about all the ways that food intersects with our life, right? And so food is culture, food is community, food is celebration, food is mourning, food is all of these other things, and really leads to a part of the vibrancy of someone's life. And when you kind of go from a scarcity mindset of people just need calories and we need to get calories to them, then solutions kind of have a narrow vision. And so that is a very elusive and not helpful, but just complicates the question that you asked of like what metrics look like. But some of the questions that we've been toying with is like, yes, capturing the amount of fruits and vegetables consumed is important, but how do we also tell the story of it's important to finance the Black-owned bakery on the corner that can provide cake to communities, right? And like, that's not what dietitians usually think about, but that's a privilege that I have in my community, and why shouldn't other communities have that? So that probably just threw a wrench in your question, so I will stop there. But that's something that we've been thinking about, or kind of what are other ways that we can look at how food access can improve communities.
So we are embarking on this mildly complicated, for those of you that do have administered or worked with somebody who has administered a nutrition program, federal or state, know that each program has its own set of units, its own metrics, its own language, even when you look at the USDA programs, even just for child nutrition, right? And so we are embarking on this. I think, Ruby, you mentioned accountability earlier. We are lovingly calling it, we're really focusing on radical accountability right now in terms of actually, in a public dashboard framework, showing real-time data. And we're gonna have to start at the basics, right? The basic metrics that we know, and to Ruby's point, don't show like really the actual impact that we're trying to, or the solutions that we're really trying to put out on the table, but it can at least show that our investments are going to the right places. And so that's been very important to our partners, our legislators, our community partners, that we're really focusing and centering the communities and the parts of the state that need help most, rather than having a flat. States typically will do a flat across the state. We have to hit every county, every community. And we're really trying to scale, really trying to turn that on its head, and again, focus on the places in the state, the communities that need investments the most. So looking at, capital infrastructure, relational infrastructure, programmatic resources, and tracking where that's going to whom and how many people are being served. And so I have the fun task right now of identifying shared performance measures across 8 agencies and figuring out the structure and the framework for those agencies to report on in a regular basis, so that, again, we can practice that accountability to our communities, to the general public, and to the legislative body who's helping make decisions about where funds are going. And with the sort of short-term goal to really show, at least for our state, to show the legislative body, show the executive, that states do need to step up and be investing in food systems work. We cannot rely on the federal government to fund and to address all the issues that we have. Local governments and tribal governments have their own constraints. And so really, modeling what it looks like for a state to really have a heavier hand in terms of financial, administrative, and legislative investments in food systems work. I'll stop there.
See some good conversation in the chat. I think traditionally my work was measured on, sales facilitated in terms of, what was coming back to the farm gate. So number of dollar value of sales, also relationships cultivated with farmers, buyers, distributors, and the like, convenings, that kind of thing. I think we talked a little bit about it on the Wallace Center value chain training. How do we better tell our story? Because this work takes time too, right? It doesn't, initially I was hired for a 1-year pilot and had to demonstrate impact in 1 year, this giant job that, nobody had ever done before. It's like, okay, let's figure it out. But some of those initial relationships that I cultivated that first year just started to bear fruit as I was leaving almost 8 years later, and so this work takes time. And I think as value chain coordinators, we need to do a better job of telling those nuanced stories. There have been a handful of case stories here and there that I've tried to kind of write up, one of which, it was meaningful for city council, but one of the new and first generation farmers that I worked with early on, I helped facilitate enough sales for them to be able to, that they could farm full time, right? And so I think that, again, that's another kind of quantitative metric, but has that kind of qualitative component to it, that's what we want to do. We want to keep more, a kind of secondary goal is keeping more folks on the land and farming in a sustainable way that they're able to sustain themselves and their communities. But I'm just going to pick up on some of the things in the chat here. Thanks, Steve. I think that's really powerful. If other folks have other examples of storytelling, I think it's or ways to tell those stories, those qualitative stories more effectively, I'd be all ears.
I really appreciate the points from all of y'all about the relationship between metrics and measuring what matters and measuring your values and accountability. And Kendall, thank you for sharing what you did about y'all's efforts around radical accountability. I think we'd all love to see that public facing dashboard once it comes into being. And thank you for everyone that is dropping some great resources to check out in the chat. Please keep adding your ideas. And also additional questions are welcome. So we started off today by talking about partnerships and the simple fact that value chain coordination is so diverse, the roles of it are so multifaceted, that it really takes an ecosystem of partners to get anything done. No one person or organization can do all of those roles. So we'd love to hear from y'all about the kinds of organizations and businesses that you partnership, and how, maybe give an example of how that partnership between your network of allies and partners and your government office was developed. Who wants to go first?
Is that directed at me?
Sure, go for it.
I mean, I think I brought up the importance that the Food Equity Council is stakeholders from all across the food system. And that has shown really interesting opportunities because now when we have an issue that is brought to the council or to the work groups, there are intersections across all 4 working groups of how we can come up with solutions. And so I think that that's really impactful, because before, and the term we use in government or nonprofit all the time, is that those conversations are really siloed. So like, I come from a federal nutrition program space where I worked in WIC, and I always wondered why we couldn't get more WIC farmers markets checks to be utilized, right? But that conversation would happen in this really small space unless I plugged into certain spaces, but it wouldn't innately come up. And so kind of zooming out and saying food equity means all of these things means that there's an urban ag group, but it has intersections with SNAP and WIC, which also connects to supporting our BIPOC food businesses, which also connects to our institutional procurement, and so on and so forth. And so how can we continue to bring stakeholders to the table that help us zoom out in that way?
I would say our work was similar in the sense that, when I came on board, I think one important piece, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I think a huge, from my perspective, an asset of anybody doing food systems or value chain coordination work at the state level or the local level, but in a governmental entity, needs to have experience being a practitioner. And so I think for me, when I came into my position, I had worked at a state agency before and had done food policy and worked with farmers across the state for almost a decade. So I think that relationship piece and then connecting that to the power of government is an absolute win-win, because people also, whether they trust the government or not, or whether that political party in power in the moment reflects their own values, they still trust you as the person. And so I think that's a huge asset that I see Ruby shaking her head. So yeah, I think that's definitely been an asset here in the state with my role. So when I came on board, I was able to bring together people from all across, conservative, big commodity farmers, very small organizations that solely do food equity and food justice and food sovereignty work, and everybody in between, and was able to kind of hash out, again, this shared plan. Not everybody got what they wanted, of course, and there was a ton, and there still is a ton of negotiation. But that's the way and that's the way I approached our plan and our framework when I came into this position. And I think that's why we have been so successful. I think the other thing I think there was a question here too about power dynamics. It's interesting being in, an executive branch and having this vision from, the governor's vision around food and hunger, while also trying to bring in other partners who are already have historically done food systems work, food policy councils, et cetera, and making everybody feel like they're a part of this larger initiative and something broader and bigger without taking credit for things that aren't yours and without doing typical governmental, I'll speak for myself, but I feel like sometimes government steps in and sort of takes programs over as if they're theirs. And so also trying to be everyday conscious about that, building partnership and building trust and relationship versus acting like the big, bad, powerful governmental entity. And again, just really trying to be human about all this. And so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Kendall. I think that reflecting back on when I first started my work at the city, I came from a public health background, very community oriented. And so I made it a priority to just listen, listen for the first 6 to 9 months, and really met with every single person and organization working in and around food and agriculture in Lexington, and then tried as best I could on a statewide basis. And I really just prioritized those relationships. And I think that that's, as value chain coordinators, I think many of us know that the work is predicated on strong relationships and trust and transparency. And so I think a lot of it is, building those individual relationships. And I started out with an advisory board that was formed prior to my hiring that kind of helped shape the work. And so we continued to meet, but that really then shifted into kind of more of a local food systems stakeholder group that was comprised of, NGOs and farmers and food businesses and university extension folks. And I think that was a way to update all those stakeholders regularly on the work that I was doing, but also to allow me to hear from them about where my work and effort was needed, where to plug in and fit in versus, like Kendall said, not going in and saying, we're taking this over, but to really understand, okay, where are the gaps with our existing local food system stakeholders, and what role can I fill and help leverage city resources to do so.
Yeah, and Ashton, I want to lift up something that you said, and something that I feel like I say all the time with the Food Equity Council, which is, and I think this is really important when you represent government, is that I always reiterate that a lot of these tables have existed, and a lot of folks have put a lot of hard work and thought into solutions. And what the Food Equity Council is hopefully doing is convening those folks who have been thinking and giving the support of the city to execute on those solutions while still respecting those tables that already existed, right? And that's where we can make kind of a distinguishing factor of, like, the Food Equity Council is a working group. The idea is that we work and we move and we progress, and we also respect those tables that have been thinking and ideating and imagining what a future could look like for Chicago's food system. And I think that's so important, because more often than not, situations like this can feel very extractive, or it can feel like another time where they're asking us to plan and it's a pilot and then there's no long-term solutions. And so that's why I always really try, like, the listening is incredibly important, and the reminder that, like, we honor the table that you have, and this is not to take away from that table, but to support that table.
One of the questions I had for y'all was just about power dynamics. Kendall, you talked about you can pick up a phone and say, I need this done, and it'll get done because you represent the governor of the whole state of New Mexico. And I was wondering how that played out, but I'm already hearing reflections from y'all of actions you're taking within your work to account for that. You talked about radical accountability, Kendall, Ruby. You talked about a process that really is centered in engaging stakeholders and the people that are supposed to be served through your work. But I wonder if there's any additional perspective or advice you have around what it's like to represent the government, which, that's a loaded thing to represent, similar to maybe working for a philanthropic foundation. There's a lot of power and clout behind you, and in any other perspective of how that shows up in your work and how you account for it.
Like, I think loaded question is right, but I think our responsibility as humans in general is to acknowledge the power that we bring in any space. And so that can be acknowledging the power that you yield because of the position that you hold, because of your socioeconomic status, all of those pieces, right? And so I often talk a lot about cultural humility and the importance of acknowledging where you yield power, what expertise you bring to the table, and how can you humbly approach situations where you're saying, I'm an expert in this, but you're an expert in your community, and how can we find a sweet spot between the two? So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think acknowledging power dynamics in all aspects of your life is incredibly important.
And the only thing I would add, I think for me is just, and Ruby, you mentioned this earlier, is like delivering on the promises that we're making, right? So if we're bringing together people for hours a week to craft this shared vision, then I was going to use it. Yeah, we better deliver on that vision, and we better make sure that those hours that people are giving, whether they were paid to or not, to show up to these meetings and strategy sessions, that is actually going to hit them at home and benefit them personally, whether they're a farmer or somebody who's eating a school meal or a senior meal. And so that's kind of the value that I carry with me. It's, we care, there's a ton of power especially when you're working for any elected official. And we have to deliver on the promises that we're making, both for ourselves as professionals and people who care deeply about this work, but also for the people that we're representing, who are elected to be in office at that time. And so, yeah.
I think Kendall to chime in, and if we don't deliver on that promise, that we're transparent as to why, right? And I think I flag that in the work groups all the time of like, even if we don't win an objective at all this year, the win for me would be that community felt like they were heard and they understood why there were pivots at every step of the process, instead of it just kind of, we're gathering information from you and then you don't really know what happens behind the curtain.
Good point.
I want to shift now to some more of the audience questions. And there's one from Karen that's really interesting. I'm curious to hear y'all's thoughts on it. But said, are major changes needed in land use practices for long-term food security? And is that true for farming, dairy, and forestry? And can urban agriculture play a bigger part long-term? So I'm curious y'all's thoughts on that, especially from your unique roles.
So I'll speak from my perspective. Land use issues are highly political, highly contentious, especially in the West, probably everywhere, but especially in a place like New Mexico and a lot of states in this country. So I will say that take that with a grain of salt, but it is sort of a bit of a political hot potato to, at least for an elected official, and I'll see again from my perspective here in New Mexico, to talk about land use issues because it's an issue of private property, right? And then you overlay private property on top of issues of stolen land and tribal sovereignty and all these other issues that are very, very complicated in a state like New Mexico. But I will say, for us, we're thinking about in our broader framework, really looking at land use that incentivizes young and beginning farmers, people who, again, are not just growing commodities to export them to an international market or growing alfalfa for, feed for cattle, but really growing, low water use foods that are nutritious that can, again, go into our food security programs, school meals, senior meals, double up food bucks, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the way that we're thinking about land use and thinking about tax code and things like that. We haven't gotten there, but there are recommendations in our framework to really be a bit more thoughtful about not only incentivizing ag, but incentivizing ag that's really, again, in the West, conserving water and protecting soil. So.
Yeah, I'll just add, I haven't focused heavily on urban ag in Lexington, but there are a couple of, there's one local nonprofit that's been in the community gardening space for a long time in Lexington that is working to creatively utilize underutilized tracts of land to teach young people how to grow food and develop businesses out of that. It's Seed Leaf here in Lexington. And so we've worked with them, the city has worked with them over the years to gift them certain tracts of land to do that. Lexington's also really unique. We were one of the first cities in the country, I believe, to have an urban service boundary. And so we land use and growth and sprawl are very heated issues. And right now we're in the middle of a comprehensive plan, which happens every 5 years, to talk about expanding that boundary. And very politically charged, the developers want us to expand the boundary, farmers and in those surrounding counties don't. And so it is quite charged discussion that I hope we'll find some creative solutions on how to do infill and redevelopment in a responsible and equitable way.
Yeah, and I guess I can chime in quickly for Chicago, which is dealing with the city has a large number of vacant lots that are city-owned vacant lots. And our urban ag work group is in the process of developing a proposal to explore how to activate some of those vacant lots into urban ag sites with growers at the center of that conversation. So, and I think there was a question in the chat also about kind of like the connection between urban ag or ag sites and kind of economic development and kind of how to have that conversation. Chicago is unique in the fact that growers do not have an urban ag business license. And so part of the conversation that we're having to connect those dots is advocating for a business license and then also having this vacant lot pilot to kind of look at examples where there might be a corner store in a residential neighborhood in Chicago. Can we start to think about what having an urban ag site in Chicago might look like for that? I think the last piece there is that there's a lot of ownership for a community to have like a community run urban ag site that can be sold within a local area. And so really kind of leaning into what that means for food sovereignty and what it means for really having ownership and agency over determining what food you're growing for community is really powerful as well.
This example of land use, I think really gets into some of what we're exploring of just how unique this role is being within government. You're talking about zoning laws and licensing and ownership, and city and state governments often own a lot of property. So there's a lot to consider now. Sue, you asked a good question. Would you be willing to come off mute and ask that?
Sure. You know, I'm just thinking, looking back, how can looking back to how we got to where we are and how your positions were created, you know, looking back over the past 10 or 15 years, how can that inform the work we do now to create the change, you know, years from now going forward? What was the role of La Montecita Co-op in New Mexico? Did that create some early energy and interest around local food, and even did that lead, and the water issues, did they converge somehow? I don't know much about Chicago, but those are just the kinds of things I was thinking about when I asked the question.
Well, Sue, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ashton.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead, please. I'm going to mute myself because there's some loud ladies next to me. Go ahead. Sorry
to speak over you. Sue, I think, so obviously that Food Link project that you're referring to that Louisville Farm to Table was a part of preceded me a little bit. However, I do think that work shed light on the fact, I mean, I feel like that was right around the time that like the term value chain coordination, soft infrastructure was kind of coming about. And, you know, thanks to Sarah Rocker and others who kind of, you know, formalized that term. It's when I was first introduced to Sarah, actually, as a part of, she was doing the evaluation, I think, for that project. But I think what it demonstrated to folks on the ground, decision makers, funders, our ag development board, that we really needed to invest in people doing the work, not in buildings, expensive buildings and infrastructure. Those are important down the road, but you've got to have that soft infrastructure to make it go. You have to have somebody waking up every day thinking about this work, building those relationships. And so I do think that investment by USDA really, and the evaluation findings from that demonstrated, just added weight to the fact that, yes, we need investment in people, and made it easier to continue to make the case for my own individual work. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I mean, we got to be a part of it. It really led.
Go ahead, Sue.
I was just going to say, I mean, we were a part of it, and for us, it lent credibility on a level that caught me a little bit by surprise.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I just want to echo what Ashton shared around the people power. That was going to be my comment. I mean, I'm in a state that we needed, you know, really intensive investment in like physical capital infrastructure as well. But to Ashton's point, you can't do it without the humans who like live and breathe this work and who want to make the connections across the food, the value chain. And we, like many states, we don't call our I mean, we look at them as VCC folks, but like they're called the farm to school coordinator, or we have 5 new staff in state government as of this last legislative session who are just focusing on farm to senior center, farm to east, farm to early care, an agricultural focus in our economic development department, another farm to school. So we are starting to see the VCC sort of this cohort, or this this really amazing group of people spreading across state government who are doing that work without calling it that. And I know that's sort of a lot of the spirit of these conversations, is we're all doing VCC work in some ways, but we may not call it that. And so that investment, and Sue, to your comment, has been sort of, 10 to 15 years in the making here, because of the sort of flagship partners like La Montanita, the New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association, and others who really saw on the front end how important it was to invest in these people who could pick up the phone and then make that connection to the person that really should be dealing with the transaction, as an example. And so we're really excited to see what this looks like, to have, again, like a cohort of individuals working at state government across agencies together on value chain work. So we'll report back in a year or so, but that all came from one farm to school position, and people started to see the impact of what those people could actually do. And then what happens when you don't have those staff, all the work that falls on other individuals in government, and managers and folks who don't want to do that work because they see how heavy it is and how intensive it is. And so that's been sort of a accidental success story here, is losing a few really critical people, and then those agencies stepping up to pay for those positions because they realize how much work it is. So I don't know, Ruby or Ashton, if you can speak. That sounds similar to your experiences.
I mean, I think people power is incredibly important, and why it was a huge push to advocate for my role existing, and in particular at the mayor's office. I think something else that's really interesting and relates to the connection about data is thinking, so like in Chicago, one of our guiding principles as a whole from Chicago 2025 was the large life expectancy gap between Black and white Chicagoans. And we know that a lot of that deals with food access, and kind of thinking about lag measures of if the Food Equity Council is doing something impactful, is looking at that data and being reminded that depending on where you live and the color of your skin, you might live a shorter life than another Chicagoan. And so that data is very powerful. And so thinking about what are the kind of smaller, and not smaller, but that don't take as long to collect, how can we start to capture the value of this work in a way that continues to validate it? And so some of the original council members that were advocating for this reached out to Baltimore and Philadelphia and New York, who have food equity councils. And the longevity of those councils was because of the data that they continue to track, because then city council, a new mayor, community cannot kind of disregard the value of this work. And so I think really thinking about that data and making sure that we include metrics that get a little bit more granular than just like pounds of collard greens grown for the year is really impactful.
All right, thank you all so much for sharing this. We're tight on time, but let's see if we can do a bumper sticker round, like a rapid fire answer. We wanted to see what advice you would have for people that are working in VCC in a business or a nonprofit. What advice would you give to them about partnering with the government? As a short answer, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll go. I would just say be patient yet persistent. So government moves slow sometimes, but keep asking for what you want and need, and hopefully there will be someone there receptive to help make it work.
I would say get to know your city, tribe, municipality, or state's budget and legislative cycle, and if there's already priorities around aligned work that you're working on, try and work with the governmental entity versus against them or alongside them. That like the power of that shared relationship and shared partnership is super important in this work.
I guess I would say find your champion. So find someone who is passionate and committed to this work, because even if it's maybe not in their duties as listed, they may help kind of move things along.
Awesome, thanks. Appreciate all sharing those. And if we could give a virtual round of applause to our panelists for all your great wisdom you shared today, and just the way you shared it. Like, I feel calmer than when we started. Just y'all really showed up in a good way for this. I think so. The next meeting of this group is going to be May 17th. We'll put the registration here in the chat. Oh, Elizabeth has already got it. And as we said before, we're looking for volunteers who want to facilitate a deep dive or just have a topic you want to explore, and we can together shape the agenda that would do that. But really looking to see what y'all want to do and help us have those conversations. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thank y'all so much.